Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. So happy to have you guys join me today. If you're new here, I'm Lumie. I am a polymer clay artist and illustrator. And in today's video, we're going to be going back in time and creating some characters from my childhood. As a person born in the year 19 redacted, I grew up watching some of the older Cartoon Network shows such as Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, Ed, Ed and Eddie, and the topic of today's video, the Powerpuff Girls. I have a nostalgic connection to this era, much like many others, and I really wanted to create the Powerpuff Girls in my style. It also reminds me of growing up with my two sisters. Whenever there was a TV show with more than one character, each of us would lay claim to a character and no one else could claim that one. I'm pretty sure this is a common thing among siblings. Now that we're all grown up and we don't live as close to each other as we used to, I thought it would be really cute to create a piece of our childhood for each of us. We all have different favorites now, so it worked out quite well. I'm creating these as a birthday gift for both of my siblings as well as myself, I guess, because I'm also making one for myself. This was my first time creating something so ambitious. I didn't realize how hard it would be to create a figurine, much less 3 figurines. This entire project took me about 2 months to create, and 2 out of the 3 of us have already had our birthdays, but it's better late than never. I struggled with how I wanted to structure this video, so what I decided to do was the first part will be sculpting the bodies and the heads for all 3 of the girls, and then I split them up individually to create their hair, their clothes, and their accessories. And then lastly, I show the process of painting all 3 of the girls. There are timestamps listed in the description if you want to go to the part that you prefer, since this video is definitely going to be very long. But before we begin, please don't forget to leave a like on this video and subscribe if you want to see more videos from me. I also have an Etsy shop and that will be linked in the description below. And with that, we can begin sculpting. I started off this project wanting to make a skeleton using wire and aluminum foil to bulk out the body. But I slowly came to the realization that I have no idea what I'm doing. I was having a really hard time making the foil stick to the wire, so I decided, okay, this is not the project to do this on, and I didn't want to spend too much time figuring this out. So for now, I was just going to sculpt the body using only clay like I usually do. Did this use a lot of clay? Yes. But I bought this pack on sale, so I was more than willing to experiment with it. I started off with a lump of white clay and shaped the legs like I usually do. The reason I went with the white clay was because 1, as I previously mentioned, the clay was on sale, and 2, because I knew I was going to be painting the faces, so I didn't want a darker clay underneath that would take multiple coats of light paint to cover it. Once the majority of the body was done, I added the neck. I used a wire to kind of stabilize the neck, but it honestly didn't really do much. I thought I was cooking here. I had placed the bodies on an acrylic block to keep the shape because I wasn't used to working with such a large piece. But because of this, the backs of their bodies were looking a little flat, so I began bulking out the back to give them more shape. A little junk in the trunk, if you will. I added big chunks of clay to the back of the legs, the butt, and the back. Before putting them in the oven for their next bake, I added a thin piece of white clay to the bottom of their feet in an attempt to make them stand on their own. Once they were out of the oven, I worked on their poses. For the most part, sculpting the arms went smoothly. I used the technique of adding a rough shape and refining it with my X-Acto knife. This incidentally led me to doing something I never thought of, which was carving out the shape that I wanted. I could just carve away the excess and then refine the shape later on. It worked out well in the end, and something I think I'll use in future projects. The real struggle appeared when it came to the hands. I knew I didn't want to do hyper-realistic hands and fingers since my style is a little bit more cartoonish. So it took a little while to figure out how I wanted to go about this. Like many other artists, hands are a struggle, so I tried my best to make cute little fingers the best I could. When it came to sculpting the peace sign for Bubbles' character, I almost scrapped it because it was so difficult to get the proportions right with the face. I still wanted to power through it because I felt like that pose really suited her character. I tried multiple different ways of attaching the hand until I found one that worked well for me. Now that the bodies were done, I moved on to sculpting the heads. I decided to make the heads separately since I knew it would be more difficult to add detail while they were attached to the body. I sculpted the nose first, and already it was a rocky start. I was having difficulty with how big I wanted the nose. I think I redid it probably about 4 or 5 times till I got it just the way I wanted. Once the noses were done, I moved on to the ears. I gave Buttercup one ear initially since I wanted her hair to cascade over that ear, but I ended up adding another one later down the line. For the eyes, I wanted to do something a little bit different. I knew that I wanted to paint them on, so I created shallow eye sockets for the eye shape. I'm not sure if I'll use this technique in the future since I don't know if it helped or hindered me, but it's something that I would definitely refine if I wanted to go this route again. For Buttercup's outfit, I decided to use 2 different shades of green and black. Since this was the Powerpuff Girls in my style, I decided to go a different route for each of their clothing. I wanted their clothing to reflect mine and my siblings' style while still maintaining some elements of the original design like the high neckline and colors. I started off by making a sleeveless turtleneck. I rolled a thin piece of clay and added it to the form, cutting off areas where necessary and adding bits and pieces until I was happy with the shape and length. I trimmed away the excess clay and used my sculpting tools with alcohol to smooth it out. After baking to set it, I moved on to sculpting her cardigan in the same fashion. I wrapped it around the form and molded it into the shape I wanted before cutting off some of the excess. I added a thick noodle to the bottom and blended everything together with my sculpting tool. I didn't remove as much as when I was sculpting her top since I wanted to have the illusion of being thick. I then smoothed everything out once more. I used my shaping tool to make some folds. As well as add some detail to the front, neckline, and sleeves of the cardigan. I repeated the same process for making her pants. I wanted the pants to have a lot of detail. I added some pockets to the front and back. And lines along the sides and front of the pants. I attached her belt and moved on to making her socks. I added a thin piece of clay to make her socks and then worked on the shoes. For the shoes, I wanted to do a combat boot, and I wanted to make it as detailed as I possibly could while still keeping in mind the cartoony style. I considered a couple different ways on how to build the shoes, but ultimately, I decided to form the general shape of the boot, bulk it out with clay, and then use my X-Acto knife to refine the shape. I added some more details to the shoes, a strip to define the bottom, and other minor details that made it look more shoe-like, such as laces, a tongue, a green strap, and a silver buckle. Once the shoes were finished, I added more details to the pants, some belt buckles, and some chains that connected from the front and the back. I baked the body and attached the head with oven bake adhesive. I thought it might be better to sculpt the hair if I saw all the pieces together to get the right proportions. But I ended up decapitating her by accident. Not the first time this will happen. Anyways, Buttercup's hair in the cartoon has these little wisps at the end, and for some reason it took me 4 or 5 tries to figure out how to do it. I added a strip to the front, and then cut off the excess. Then I cut semicircular shapes to create the hairline. I baked the head to maintain the shape of the hair and attaching it back to the body, then added some strips of clay to frame her face. I also attached the missing ear that I mentioned earlier. Now all I needed to do was add all of the little accessories that I made for her. Some little hair clips, her earrings, and a heart charm to her belt buckle. And with that, Buttercup's sculpt is complete. And we're gonna move on to making Blossom next. When it came to Blossom's outfit, I knew exactly what I wanted to make for her. The sister I'm creating this for likes to dress in a little bit more of a soft girl aesthetic, so that's the kind of look I was going for. For her top, I went with a long sleeve turtleneck, sculpting it the same way I did for Buttercup. Using thin strips of clay, I covered the areas where I wanted the top to go, molding it around the body and cutting off pieces that weren't necessary. I also removed some bulk from the shirt and used my sculpting tool to smooth it out. I had to be careful not to take too much off and also make sure that I pushed the clay between the arms so that it looked like it wrapped all the way around. To finish off before baking, I added some creases to her shirt and cleaned up her neckline. I baked and sanded that area like I did for all of my previously baked pieces and started on the dress. The style of dress that I wanted to make had pleating on the bottom, and that was the most difficult part of sculpting this dress. I tried at first to add multiple chunks of clay in a rough shape around the body in hopes I could smooth them out later while maintaining the separation, but that didn't really work. But from that, I knew at least that I wanted the bottom part of the dress to be thicker than the upper half. So I redid the bottom part of the dress, adding a thin strip of clay to go around the body, and then wrapped a thicker noodle of clay around the bottom half to bulk out that area. I then smoothed that out with a shaper tool. Once I was happy with the shape, I used my shaper tool to add the pleats. Lastly, I added the straps around her shoulders. I cut the excess from the longer strips and blended them into the top half of the dress. Then I placed it in the oven to bake. I moved on to making the basic shape of her socks that I'll be adding to later, and attached a black belt around her waist before moving on to her shoes. I created the shoe the same way I did for Buttercup. I made the basic shape, then refined it using my X-Acto knife. I added a thick strip to define the bottom portion of the shoe, then cut out a piece in the center so that her socks could be showing. I placed her in the oven to bake and then added the white to the cutout area for her socks. For Blossom's socks, I wanted to add frills around the top to match the soft girl aesthetic. I started off with a thin sheet of clay that I added small lines to create the indentation for the frills. To complete her shoes, I added some silver belt buckles, and to finish off her dress, I added 3 pink buttons in the center and a silver chain around the front and back. Now that the body was all done, I moved on to sculpting the hair. I used a pencil to mark out the different sections and started adding thin strips of clay to cover them. I then added another slightly thicker piece of clay along the bottom of her head for the long hair in the back. I added some indents in that piece to create the illusion of different strands and blended those two pieces together. I then started working on her bangs, starting with a thin strip, cutting away the excess, and cut out a small portion to create a separation in the bangs. Using my sculpting tool, I created the different strands. I added some thin strips to frame her face and added a thick chunk of clay to the back of her head for her updo. I used my sculpting tool once more to create the illusion of different strands. I wasn't going for realism, I just wanted there to be a hint of different sections in her hair. I think out of all of the 3 girls, sculpting Blossom's hair was my favorite. Lastly, I added some earrings to her ears. I created the bow and added it to the top of the updo. I added a small belt buckle to her belt and her heart charm on her belt loop. With that, Blossom was done, and last but not least, we'll move on to sculpting Bubbles. For Bubbles, I wanted to go with a more Y2K style, since this sister has many different styles, but I figured this one would represent her the most. So I mixed white with both dark and light blue clay to make the blue for Bubbles' outfit. Similarly to how I sculpted the previous outfits, I started off with thin strips of clay to cover the body where I wanted her top to go and cut and refine the shape until I was satisfied. For her top, I wanted to do another long sleeve turtleneck, but I wanted it to be a little bit more of a sweater than a shirt, so I made it a little bit thicker. After cutting away some of the clay to make it an even thickness and smoothing out the form, I added a little more clay to the bottom like I did for Blossom's skirt to make it thicker. Once everything was smoothed out, I used my sculpting tool to define different shapes around the neck, some creases for the sleeves, and some extra bunching around the bottom of the shirt. After that was baked and sanded, I moved on to making her skirt. The skirt wasn't particularly difficult to do. The only thing that made it difficult was that her behind was a little too low, and because I didn't want the skirt to look too long, it took a little bit of careful shaping so that her butt wasn't hanging out. I added some pockets and other details to the skirt off camera, and then I moved on to making her shoes. The reason I made her shoes before her socks was because I wanted her to have leg warmers that were kind of bulky and covered part of her shoes. The process of making her shoes was the same as the previous two. By this point, I had a pretty good grasp on making the shoes and was happy with how they turned out. Once the shoes were baked, I moved on to making her leg warmers. I started them off the same way I did the other socks, but I soon realized I needed a different approach. I was looking at a reference image as I was making these and wasn't sure the best way to go about creating the folds. At first I was thinking that I would carve out the negative space in between the folds, but that didn't really work. So after that, I decided to use my sculpting tool instead to define the folds, and that ended up working better. I added some noodles to the top of the leg warmers to bulk it out and smooth those into the rest of the socks. Well, leg warmers. Time to move on to her hair. I started off her hair as usual with a thin strip to cover the entire head in yellow clay and shaped around the back and forehead. Not forgetting to decapitate her in the process, of course. Bubbles' hair for me was deceptively simple. The reason I say this was because I thought that creating her pigtails would be a breeze. I was having a hard time creating the right shape where the top part would stay flat to her head while the rest of it would protrude out, kind of like the examples I show here. But after fiddling with the shape, I got the desired result that I wanted and it looked perfect, if I do say so myself. I then added a thin wisp of hair to the center of her forehead and then used my sculpting tool to create a separation for her pigtails. Once baked, I added some face framing pieces. I then started adding the rest of her accessories on her body, like her hair clips, earrings, and her hair bubbles. In the original Powerpuff Girls, she doesn't have these in her hair, but in recent adaptations of her design, she does. I think they suit her quite well and fit the aesthetic I was going for, so I thought I would add those in even though it doesn't stay absolutely true to the original. I attached the bows on her leg warmers and the heart keyring on her belt loop with some super glue. Now that the sculpting's all complete, we can move on to painting. For their skin, I mixed together yellow, red, brown, and white to create a close match to their skin tone in the cartoon, making sure to cover any of the exposed areas where the skin was. I believe I did 3 to 4 coats for each of them. Once those coats were dry, I painted the whites of their eyes following the indents that I created while sculpting the face. Then I marked out where I wanted the pupils and the eyebrows to be placed in pencil and filled in both of those with the corresponding colors. For Blossom, pink and orange. For Bubbles, blue and yellow. and for buttercup, it was green and black. I'm literally holding my breath the entire time I'm doing this. I moved on to blushing certain parts of their faces like their cheeks, noses, tips of their fingers, knuckles, and knees. I mixed together a light pink paint and thinned it out to be quite watery so that it would go on blotchy. I used a paper towel to remove the excess and built up the color over multiple layers. I wanted to try this way of creating the blushing to see how it would work, and although I'm happy with how it turned out, I don't think that I'll use this technique in the future. I was afraid that after multiple coats, because it was so watery, the base paint would start flaking off. Moving on to the scariest part of all, the eyelashes. I purchased some acrylic pens, hoping that it would make it easier to create a thin line across the tops of their eyes. It went on much smoother and cleaner than if I did it with a paintbrush, so I was really happy with that. I also added some pupils with brown paint. I thought black would be a little bit too harsh. I used another one of those acrylic pens in this really cool silver color to add some shine to their jewelry and other accessories. You're probably wondering at this point, where are their mouths? Well, I tried to add some, but it looked so bad, so I just decided to skip it. For the final touch, I added some highlights to their eyes, and then I moved on to glazing. I glazed all of the pieces in Liquitex acrylic matte varnish. Light on the matte because they ended up being shiny for some reason, but as I was showing them to my partner, he quite liked the shiny look, so I thought I would keep it like that. And with that, my version of the Powerpuff Girls are complete. Now, this project was far from perfect. There were so many ups and downs, so many things I sculpted for the first time, and so many things that I wasn't sure of throughout this entire process. It was definitely a huge learning experience for me. And although there are some things that I would change to the design, I'm really happy with how they turned out. There are things that I would take with me when I do future projects, and there are things that I will definitely not be doing in future projects. And I don't think I would have learned all of these things if I didn't challenge myself. In the end, I hope that my siblings really enjoy their gifts. I worked very hard on them. Not trying to guilt trip them or anything, and I'm really excited to give it to them. It really is different when you create a gift that you worked really hard on and you just know that it's from the heart, you know? Not to get all sentimental or anything. I also hope that you guys enjoyed watching the process and learned something, although take everything I say with a grain of salt since I'm still just a girl trying to figure things out. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want to see more videos from me, and leave a comment down below if you have a favorite Powerpuff Girl. Mine is Buttercup, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!